Okay. All right, members, I think we're actually a little bit ahead on this. Dr. Goodwin, you've got first the lead scientist report. This is file item number 11, members. File item number 11. And the lead scientist report is first, following which will be our first look at the draft Delta Science Plan. Dr. Goodwin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Is the mic working? Great. Well, good afternoon, everyone. And we're going to start with the lead scientist report. And as you can probably see, there's a lot of things going on in the last month or so since I last reported to you. So I'll just step through these very quickly. If you have any questions, please interrupt. So the first item on here is that the State Water Resources Control Board has just released the first ever statewide survey of contaminants in sport fish for California's rivers and streams. And there's several interesting points about this. The first is that the monitoring and research was funded from multiple sources, including the CalFed Ecosystem Restoration Program. And it was put together through a fairly sophisticated statistical design, because you're always wondering, if you're taking point measurements about what's going on, how representative of that, of what's happening across the landscape and across many river systems. So there was a lot of thought given to that. But also, what's remarkable is how the state has chosen to put this information out to the public. And I would encourage you to take a look at the My Water Quality webpage that summarizes in a very clear way the results of this study and status of water quality. And in particular, it deals with mercury contamination. So I think you'll see this coming before you many times in the next few years, because there's concern not just with the public health if people eat too many contaminated fish. And so to deal with this, there's a major public education program underway. But also it has implications to wetland restoration projects, because there's a possibility that methyl mercury can be released into the environment. So how you actually conduct these restoration projects is a very big issue. If you want to know more about this, Dr. Rainer Honecke, who will be up with us in a few minutes, much of his career has been based on this issue, so we're very fortunate to have someone with a lot of in-depth knowledge related to that. The second item is our recent CARBA seminar. If you recall, these CARBA seminars are hosted for us through the UC Davis, and these have become very popular, so we try and pick some of the really hot topics. And this particular one was organized by CARBA in collaboration with the California Nevada American Fisheries Society chapter. It was hosted by Matt Nebriga and Peter Moyle and many others. And these seminars are really beginning to take off. Again, for the second time in a row now, we've had more than 200 attendees at these workshops. And based on some of your suggestions that you gave us at the end of last year, rather than just getting people together and listening to a series of presentations, they've become a lot more interactive. And one of the things which we're asking the organizers of these seminars to do is to develop a peer-reviewed article or some kind of summary, not just of the presentations by the speakers, but also the feedback with the attendees. The other thing which is notable is that we've also trying to bring in, as part of these workshops, a really big name from the outside. Someone who gives us a totally different perspective, who can sort of push our thinking and really engage with our scientists. So this particular topic was on the tidal marshes and native fishes in the Delta, and will restoration make a difference? So of course this is a huge part of the thinking behind BDCP and a lot of the restoration going on. And if these benefits can be documented for fish production, what elements should be included and rolled into future restoration designs? So a very strong practical application. So also for those people who are unable to attend which is quite difficult under sequestration, at least for the federal employees. These presentations are available through the CARBO website. You can also get to it through the Delta Science program, and you'll find both the PowerPoints as well as the oral presentations available. A third major activity in the last month, on June the 4th and 5th, the Interagency Ecological Program pulled in their science advisory group. This is a very high level advisory group, again, partly insiders, people who really know what's going on, and then some outside experts. And for this particular review, the IEP leadership had requested the juvenile fishes monitoring program to be reviewed that looks at salmon, steelhead, and delta smelt. It was actually a very productive couple of days. This is a peer review panel. It's a standing panel. They know a lot of what's going on. And the depth of their questioning, their requests for additional information really show that they're going to address this issue in a lot of depth. And IEP are expecting their draft report in early July. The fourth item was, that's listed on here, is the Puget Sound Institute, who hosted a workshop at the end of last month. And this was just great timing for us in the science program. This was organized by the now chair of the Independent Science Board, Dr. Tracy Collier, and several of the folks in Puget Sound. And their idea was to invite the lead scientists from the major ecosystem restoration programs around the country. For example, the Everglades, the things which are going on the Louisiana coastline, Columbia Estuary, Chesapeake Bay. And within this workshop, they posed several questions. So to address those questions, they also invited some of the staff from the various science programs to interact at the science level. And so the four major themes, and Dr. Collier may want to discuss this a little further later, but they had four topics that they wanted to share experiences. The first was setting priorities for science in the face of uncertainty. What are folks doing? How are you doing it? The second was on the topic of effective adaptive management. Is it working for you? How are you doing it? The third topic was, in all of these major programs, there's multiple agencies, multiple stakeholders, multiple programs. How do you go about coordinating those activities, and what has worked and what hasn't worked within your systems? And the fourth area, which I thought was really interesting, and it's certainly consistent with what the National Science Foundation is looking at, and that is what should be the role of social science in the research for ecosystem recovery. And that was a very interesting topic. Of course, most people get into the economics, but what came out of this session was there's a lot of other branches where social scientists could really give some analysis and insight. Out of that workshop, there's plans for a peer-reviewed publication to see where the commonalities are, and that's underway. But Dr. Collier, as we said, it was just an excellent meeting you, I thought. And if this is going to become part of a series, I think it's something we would really like to host down here in California next time. The fifth topic here is I just wanted to highlight a recent publication. And one of the great things about sitting in this job and working with the Delta Science program is the quality of staff that you actually have at your disposal. So I wanted to profile this paper a little bit because the paper was led by Chris Enright, and you've heard him speak on a couple of occasions. But Chris is really one of these truly innovative thinkers, someone who can think beyond conventional wisdom, be that one step ahead of the process. And for those of you who've worked with Chris, you'll know exactly what I mean. So he's pushed a lot of the agenda on your wetland restoration, the big picture thinking. In the science plan we'll talk about in the moment, this concept of alternative futures he's been a big champion of. But I thought I would just profile a little bit about the thinking in this paper because it's really intriguing. It was published in Estuaries and Coasts, which is a very high-end journal. Multiple authors, again, which is moving towards concepts of community science. The co-authors were Dr. Culbertson with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and John Bureau, who you've already heard from, at the USGS. And it also shows the value of monitoring data that the USGS has had out for now many years, because it enabled this group of researchers to really uncover an entirely unexpected process of what's going on. So if you look at a healthy tidal marsh, the high marsh is going to be at an elevation that is above high mean tide level. So it means that you only get water out over the marsh plain infrequently. If you're on a neap tide, the low tide, within a 2-week cycle, the water won't be out on the marsh plain. But on the spring tides, there's extensive flooding. And the ecological value of these tidal marsh plains in terms of the area of inundation, the contributions to the productivity of the marshes is extremely high. So the paper started out looking at those relationships. And then they started noticing that these really high tides, the spring tides that occur cyclically, typically in this part of the world there's a 2-week cycle, so you tend to get spring tides every 2 weeks. And these tides are driven by the alignment and the gravitational pull of the sun and the moon. So basically when the moon and the sun are fully aligned, those are the big tides. When the moon is off to one side and the sun's pulling in another direction, those tides are a little less. So when the tides are in alignment for these really big tides over the last few decades, those high tides tend to occur at night. So if you recall a few weeks ago on those super tides when there was flooding around the Bay Area, that sort of occurred early in the morning. Well, why should we care about this? Well, over the last few decades, when the water flows out onto these marsh plains at night, the air cools off, and when you have very shallow water, it will cool off that layer of water that's sitting on the marsh plain. So at night, the water's out there on the marsh plain. The water then drains off the marsh plain. It's cooler water. It gets back into the system. So what they first of all documented is that this is a major source of cold water. And if you recall from some of the earlier presentations...
A major source or the major source?
A major source of the cold water. It's a cooling mechanism within the system. What they went on to look at, and Chris looked out over, I think, the next 323 years, is that with the shifting of the tides, in the coming decades, the next century, these high tides will no longer be occurring at night, but they're likely to occur much more frequently during the day. And then you have a very, very different process. Here the water flows out onto the marsh plain, middle of the day, with the sun heating a shallow layer of water. It's going to be a heat source. That water then comes off the marsh plain, it gets into the channels, and we're likely to see an increase in water temperature. So the process has been identified. It needs to be quantified. It will certainly become a factor, I imagine, when we're looking into the long-term future of wetland restoration. How do we compensate for this? How significant it is? But I just put that out. It's a fascinating piece of science. The math is quite elegant. But I just want you to realize that this is the quality of scientists that you've got thinking about these problems and being able to anticipate the future outcomes. So great job, Chris. Two other solid science. First of all, if there's any questions, you please interrupt. I put a brief note there about the collaborative adaptive management team. This is being in the process of being set up. This has been put in place in response to Judge O'Neill's recent ruling on the remand process, which is the process which is trying to juggle the two biological opinions. This adaptive management team is being co-chaired by Leo Winternitz and Val Connor, who's sitting here. So if you have any questions, I would definitely defer those to Val, but we've been very impressed about how this group's been put together. The Delta Science program is involved, and we expect that a lot of our involvement will be ensuring the type of synthesis products which will help that team to be successful will be coming through either co-sponsored or other activities with the Delta Science program. And the example which we put in there that we've heard from many members of the Council is that on July the 22nd, another date for your calendar, the science programming collaboration with many others, including Fish and Wildlife Service, will be hosting the predation workshop, the first workshop.
Dr. Goodwin, this is particularly significant in my opinion because a judge is sitting on top of a process where state and federal agencies who've been for years promising to deliver an adaptive management structure and system but haven't yet done it are now under a year deadline for the initial stage to start developing it. As you know, they went in first asking for a 3-year delay over the existing and legal biological opinions. Does this process have more than an adaptive management team, or the body you're sitting on, or is that it? And if so, is the structure of that, the participation in it, and the rules on decision making, if there are any, serve as a model, not just for the Delta Science Plan, but for the Bay Delta Conservation Plan? Some state officials have said it may well be a model for the Bay Delta Conservation Plan.
Yeah, I think it's very, very early stages, and I'll certainly defer to Dr. Connor here, but I think that is the way it's being viewed, to see what can be achieved through this process.
Who's on the group? What agencies?
Could we bring Dr. Connor
Sure.
as the